Hello, I'm Scott Hessels, a media artist based in Hong Kong, and my artworks explore new relationships between the moving image and the environment, which means I often work with engineering, programming, and natural sciences. I'm going to talk about a work-in-progress data visualization project that uses trajectory as its design and is part of a larger investigation into aerial traffic. My creative practice uses forces found in nature, and I've just completed a series of 6 kinetic public sculptures that use natural energy in the creation of the moving image. For the past 8 years, I've been running an art science education initiative called Extreme Environments. We partner art and design students with scientific researchers and join existing field studies that are dedicated to the protection of these endangered resources. Students collect data with the scientists and transform it into new media artworks for an exhibition. I've led expeditions into field stations in Antarctica, the Mojave Desert, caves in Vietnam, and underwater in the Solomon Islands. It's one of the most effective environmental outreach programs in Asia, with social, digital, and traditional media reaching millions. I've spoken about both sustainable cinema and extreme environments at previous ISEAs. However, today I'll be talking about research I've been doing now for nearly 2 decades under the name celestial mechanics, addressing the need for a multivariant visual system that represents the current realities of aerial traffic management and congestion. Starting in 2004, I've been creating speculative designs, kinetic sculptures, immersive systems, and data visualization animations that challenge traditional display systems and semiotics of the hardware above us. The world's largest environmental disaster was felt and seen by no one. When the Chinese military recently demonstrated their anti-satellite missiles, exospheric trash was scattered across our heavens further than any other man-made event in history. In 2009, 2 communication satellites collided over Russia, the first crash attributed to simply too many machines above us and completely unpredicted by any of the sophisticated tracking softwares. NASA has warned repeatedly that unless addressed, the congestion of machines and junk will cause more collisions and end our dreams of space travel. Closer to ground, a few weeks ago a drone nearly hit Air Force One, and for years now personal drones have been keeping water-bearing helicopters in California fires from reaching their destinations, resulting in the loss of millions of dollars of property. Once the exclusive domain of military and government institutions, airspace is at a moment in history when it's transitioning towards both privatization and personalization. In January of 2019, there were 5,000 total satellites. SpaceX has now been approved to place 42,000 satellites in our skies, and Amazon's Kuiper project will send 3,236 more into 3 different altitude orbits. So in 2 years, that's an increase of 10 times. So despite the proliferation, each industry using our airspace generally only focuses on their own assets. However, more concerning is that each also stays within a specific aerial altitude range, treating the verticality as lanes of traffic and ignoring what's above and directly below. But safety issues are rising, partially due to our inability to visualize and display the massive transscalar real estate and movement. There is no model that represents the entire evolving technosystem in one visual strategy. Using 3D modeling, programming, and digital painting, the first celestial mechanics was an animation created for dome-shaped planetariums. Instead of stars, the night sky programmed and interpreted the paths, behaviors, and patterns of over 30,000 aerial technologies. Produced at UCLA, dozens of government, science, and private agencies provided the raw mathematical data, the actual longitude, latitude, and altitude of nearly 50 airborne technologies, mostly in text form. I led a team of 10 animators and programmers to plot the data into 3D space and then stylize it, combined with sound design by George Lucas's Skywalker Sound. This section shows low Earth orbiting satellites. I can name every satellite, and their footprint, how much of the ground they see. So this is a visualization how much you're being watched from above. The most successful section of the film stylized 12 hours of airplane movement over the USA. I secured a raw text file of over 20,000 commercial plane movements collected every 3 minutes. My student at the time, Aaron Koblin, was on the celestial mechanics team, and he explored ways to interpret that air traffic data. To put this in a historical context, these two animations are 2 years apart. The facets video above, produced by NASA, was the best representation of air traffic in 2002, and Aaron's processing sketches for my artwork became a viral sensation, eventually landing in the Museum of Modern Art. This approach to trajectory would become iconic in the emerging field of information arts, and its influence can still be seen in works today. Although I was really just, at first, interested in using planetariums as media art, I was somehow immediately perceived as an expert in aerial visualization, and now remarkably, 3 different nationalities have funded me since 2004, and I've been watching the proliferation over the past decades. When I made this video, there were only 2 GPS satellite networks in the sky, ours and Russia's. Now there are 6. On GPS, nearly every mobile phone in your pockets right now is currently talking to a GPS satellite, dictating all location to the meter and all time to the microsecond. Think about that. A small number of invisible machines decide all global time and place. I collected the paths of every GPS satellite from all 6 countries that currently have networks in orbit. A 7th is going up right now. So I took one GPS satellite trajectory from each country, and I made it a metallic arc in a 3D model for a mobile that would indirectly reference both a compass and a historic timepiece. By creating a physical representation of each trajectory, the artwork reminds us that aerial traffic, we rarely consider the political, economic, and cultural forces that place it up there, and we cannot accept out of sight, out of mind. The representation of movement as a line through space in both 2D and 3D contexts is seemingly obvious, yet has a history that parallels the larger developments in visual representation. Trajectory, a timeline through a space, is now the standard method of revealing aerial machine movement in both aeronautic and aerospace industries. And despite our long history of flinging things at each other, stone-tipped arrows and spears go back 64,000 years, it took us until 1700 to label the scientific visualizations to improve our aim. This 1669 image from Mariner's magazine shows the line of arc of cannon-fired projectiles at various heights, and shortly thereafter the word trajectory first appears in the meaning that holds today, a curve that a body describes in space. Multivariant visualization is a simultaneous visual representation of multiple variables to make complex data dynamic, universal, and valuable. Bruce Mao said, "Visualizing speed was the design problem of the last century, but it has been replaced by the problem of visualizing growth." That's all easily said, but consider the design problems involved. Every launch potentially passes by drones, helicopters, planes, weather balloons, 3 layers of satellites, and debris, all within the same airspace, but vertically separated by thousands of kilometers. One can see the machine, or one can see the environment, but both cannot be seen in one image. Add to that, and each of those layers has objects moving at wildly different speeds. Helicopters at 160 miles per hour, planes at 550 miles per hour, satellites in low Earth orbits at 17,000 miles per hour. A true representation cannot show a basketball-sized satellite moving 40 times faster than a building-sized plane. Hong Kong has now funded research into alternative display systems to show the variations in speed and scale. I designed 12 different systems that proposed ways to solve the problem and presented them at ISEA in 2016. While this has been interesting research, none really accurately showed the entire technosystem from drones all the way up to satellites. It may seem odd to say that there are things that we can't imagine, but the massive transscalar real estate and movement is beyond our spatiotemporal reasoning. As an interesting metaphor, a rare medical condition called aphantasia, literally stated as blind in the mind's eye. In terms of seeing all aerial traffic at once, we all suffer from aphantasia. I decided to step away from trying to find an impossible solution and return to the moment that drew me initially as a child, which was a kid watching the Apollo launches. I've gathered the actual trajectory data of every rocket that has pierced the Kármán line, the 100-kilometer high border between Earth and space. Since 1957, when Sputnik left our atmosphere for the first time, over 6,600 rockets have left our atmosphere. Unlike most visualization of satellite traffic that show the final orbits of satellites once they've been placed in the sky as a result of these launches, I wanted to reveal the first moments of the vehicles leaving our planet, emphasizing the aesthetics of their path, the arc, the trajectory. We manually dug deep into NASA's text-based historical data to collect the information on engine types and payloads, and matched each with global launch sites and the angle of each pad. German-based Astos Solution was consulted to help us create more precise simulations. Normally, they'd be contacted prior to a launch to optimize trajectory and spacecraft design, but they were kind enough to run simulation of past launches, even though that really had no practical application to the industry. So their support was invaluable. Celestial Mechanics 5, Reaching, is a unique mix of historical data run in contemporary simulation tools. The Astos data provided even more detail regarding the timing and heading, and once the launches from each site were matched to the appropriate trajectory files, I was able to recreate that perfect arc of every single launch. Rockets, though, are similar to car models. Once a successful version is designed, it's used repeatedly. The same is true for their payloads. Once optimized, often repeated. When these are matched to fixed launch pads like Cape Canaveral and angles, one site may have identical trajectories for dozens of launches over the years. In those cases, I offset identical launches to show the number more clearly and resulted in the flowers from each site that appear in the film. Currently, it's being digitally painted by my team in Budapest, and we start with Sputnik's launch at the Baikonur Cosmodrome and end with SpaceX, marking the beginning of an era where national interests will be eclipsed by commercial enterprises. In under 2 minutes, the film shows launches from sites highlighted by location, creating a unique understanding and representation of the last century's space race. The animation becomes a type of competition, a call and response among nationalities as each scrambles to best the previous. Until now, we have relied on visualizations to help us understand spatiotemporal complexity. Soon, self-driving cars will critically consider the context and movement of a wide range of objects, both in the field of vision and outside of it. In time, we may become comfortable with accepting problems that we cannot imagine. Perhaps this is a sign that our reliance on our mind's eye may be ending as we grow to trust the machine's eyes themselves. It seems like all life reaches for the sky. It's surprising that the advanced, hulking machines we use to leave Earth and reach for the heavens can often be both poetic and beautiful. Both as a metaphor and in reality, a launch represents our strive to rise above. Thank you very much, and please visit the site for more information and keep a lookout for the film, which will be released later this year.
Hi, and thanks for coming along to this presentation. I'm Paul Dunham and I'm presenting a sound installation called TwttrGraph. However, in line with similar works I'm creating, the work has been renamed TwtT. A while ago now, I was looking at an obsolete piece of media technology, a telegraph key. And I was thinking about the impacts of time and use on the erosion of its mechanisms and the changes to the materiality of sound that those changes had created. I then wondered about what relationship existed between electric telegraphy and contemporary technologies. So I bought the telegraph key, and then another, and then I bought another, and then I bought some more. By way of introduction, I'll briefly talk about the connection between telegraphy, social media, and specifically Twitter as background to the conceptualization and creation of this sound installation. After a brief discussion on media archaeology as an approach used in developing the work, I'll present TwtT itself. So what is social media, or more specifically, what is a social media? Opposing perspectives of social media can be loosely categorised along technology and socio-cultural lines. As technology, social media are considered to be a set of web-based or mobile platforms that allow an audience to interact and share content or to participate in social networking. From this perspective, this can be considered an expression of sociality through technologies. Alternatively, rather than a specific articulation of technologies, a social media can be used to identify a specific manifestation of a massively complex social formation. So by questioning the assertions that social media is a 21st century phenomenon that defines the social via particular media technologies, lines can be drawn between past social practices and technological invention in today's social media platforms. When researching these different perspectives, Twitter kept reoccurring in a number of narratives, so this seemed an appropriate medium to explore further. Within the general history of communication, some similarities exist between Twitter and the Telegraph. Both mediums brought an immediacy and brevity to communication, compressed space and time, and brought the private into the public arena. The electric telegraph's significant advance in the global reach and immediacy of communication is one that is amplified by social media platforms such as Twitter. The interplay between reading and writing in a world defined by machine interactions has had an impact on the written word. And this can be seen in the abbreviated forms of language used in telegraphic writing that continues in the use of abbreviated words, internet acronyms and emojis that can be seen in tweets. The media archaeology approach I've adopted for this work allows for the exploration of the material possibilities of obsolete media through a practical, operative and sensual engagement with the object. As such, my engagement with the telegraph key follows Wolfgang Ernst's material approach, whereby through the artifact's technical execution it is no longer an historical object devoid of function, but actively generates a sensual and informational presence as an expression of itself. However, this approach focused on inscription media, and the telegraph doesn't reproduce stored sound. Rather, it transports an electrical impulse that linked sound events over a network. Furthermore, the telegraph did not operate at the real-time transmission speeds of contemporary media. To find a way of conceptually interfacing Twitter with the electric telegraph, I somewhat appropriated Shintaro Miyazaki's algorithmic approach. This approach reveals machinic processes, signals, oscillations and rhythms by slowing them down as a way of giving them a humanly perceptible material presence. Creatively appropriating the telegraph key and returning it to an operative state and using Morse codes, dots and dashes is one way of sonifying the signal transmission of Twitter. It can also be a way to slow a digital signal down to hear what would otherwise be inaudible. Through the changes of material state between inscription, the tweet, and transmission, the retweet, TwtT can be considered a form of media archaeological reverse engineering and a metabolic slowing down of the present through the past. Replaying the messages in this way represents what some consider one noisy medium through another to create a presence of telegraphic communication within the contemporary realm of social media. The minimal physical appearance of click-tweet foregrounds the row of telegraph keys as the primary sound source. The use of a single key is iterated 6 times to expose and exploit the individual sonic characteristics of each key and the nuances manifest in their material differences. Using 6 keys also allows a larger Morse character set to be incorporated into the work. All other components are enclosed within the acrylic plinth. Central to the work is a Raspberry Pi providing all the necessary connectivity options and hosting processing for Pi as the development software. A custom designed circuit board provides power and switching for a set of solenoids with each key actuated by a solenoid. The circuit board is connected to the input-output ports of the Raspberry Pi. Connected to the Raspberry Pi is also a small amplifier with speakers housed at the ends of the enclosure. This is used to provide a further sonic presence of telegraphy, with the sine tone being interrupted by the dots and dashes of the encoded message. Using a custom library, the processing sketch connects to Twitter via Wi-Fi, grabs a bunch of messages for retweeting, and these messages are transformed from text to Morse code elements, which in turn are transformed into electric pulses to actuate the solenoids and engage the telegraph keys. ClickTweet has 2 modes of operation, a live and an archive mode. Live mode listens for and replays messages as they are transmitted in real time. This mode also allows for audience interaction through the use of keyword tweets. Archive mode uses Twitter's search method to return a collection of tweets matching specified keywords. These messages are stored in a database and processing, awaiting replay selection. ClickTweet uses Morse code's timing to provide its metrical structure. Just as the dot duration is the basic unit of time measurement in Morse encoded transmission, it is used as the basis for the tempo for ClickTweet's compositions. Using a technique to measure operator proficiency in Morse transmission provides the tempos of either 125 or 150 beats per minute. 3 compositional forms have been developed to provide the rhythmic patterns for the Morse-encoded Twitter messages. These are framed within the context of Henri Lefebvre's rhythm analysis. As such, the compositional forms can be described as eurhythmic, polyrhythmic, or arrhythmic, so rhythms of equality, of diversity, or rhythms of disturbance. Eurythmia isolates the message's Morse code elements and plays each element serially across the keys. The individual rhythmic patterning of a single message can be heard in this form, and this is the form that I showed in the earlier video. Polyrhythmia plays a different message on each key. This mode exhibits moments of synchronization, syncopation, and disturbance through the threading of the message's rhythmic patterns. The very machine-like rhythmic structures are more evident in this compositional form. As each message is completed, the key rests. The space in the replayed messages opens up further each time this occurs, making the rhythms more evident until only one key is present. Arrhythmia can be substituted into either of the previous compositional forms. Arrhythmia disrupts the Morse elements by randomly changing the timing of the space elements used in each individual character. This also allows for a larger number of character combinations, further disrupting Morse's patterns. This pattern disruption is based on Myron Wish's mid-1960s hypothesis on signal confusibility in Morse code. This compositional form is a sonic manifestation of Wish's hypothesis. The next short video is an example of the polyrhythmic form. The purpose of including a video element in this work is to disrupt the rhythms we innately use if we were to read text through a standard visual interface. The video element of the work displays each individual message character, or keywords as they are transmitted in the case of a eurythmic form, or as whole words in polyrhythmic form. Displaying the message in this way disrupts the human rhythm of reading and presents a more machine-like prosody to the message. As such, it represents the near erasure of words with Morse code's temporal logic, placing the focus on the prominence of the beats. So this concludes my presentation. Thanks for coming along. I hope ClickTweet has provided a new perspective of electric telegraphy's place within the wider context of social media through this audio-visual work.
Thank you, everyone, for these very interesting presentations. Before we get started, I'd like everyone to introduce themselves. I'll start. My name is Louis-Philipe Rondeau. I'm a professor at the School of Digital Art, Animation and Design of the Université du Québec à Chicoutimi, also called the NAD School. And I'm also a digital artist. I'd like to hand over the presentation to Scott.
Okay. I'm Scott Hessels. I'm based at the School of Creative Media in Hong Kong, originally from UCLA. Mostly, I'm a professor and a sculptor, usually working with large format kinetic public sculptures and public works. Although, as you saw from the video, I also do a lot of data visualization stuff. Thanks.
Thank you. Jesse? Mute.
That classic problem of the day. I'm Jesse Jackson. I'm a Canadian artist based in Southern California. I'm a professor of electronic art and design at the University of California, Irvine. And my work is usually comes from architecture because that's how I was trained originally.
Thank you. And Paul?
Yes, hi. I'm Paul Dunham. I'm based across the School of Engineering and Computer Science and the New Zealand School of Music at Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand. I'm doing a PhD that uses obsolete media and connects those to different forms of contemporary media through sound installations.
Great. So let's start off. I've got a question for Scott. And I really enjoy the visualizations you create. They're very, they allow us to awaken our senses to things that we don't usually see. First question I have is, do you feel that the devices we place in the sky and in outer space are evidence of the Anthropocene? Will they impact the environment on a geological scale, or they're just something that is fugitive?
I think it already is affecting us on a geological scale. When the Chinese shot down the anti-aircraft missiles, that debris is literally the largest environmental disaster. And many of the astronomers are saying that once Elon Musk launches his 43,000 microsatellites, our ability to visualize out into space, to actually see the planets around us, will become incredibly restricted. So I think it's definitely part of the Anthropocene. I also think that, as I mentioned in the paper, we're at a very much of a transition. It was always very much a government and private agency practice to put satellites in the sky, and now people are launching their iPads. Drones are being launched. Elon Musk is putting up. So more and more, the ability to keep track of who's actually putting things up there is disappearing. And I think that's going to have a huge impact in the next 5 to 10 years. Wow,
thank you. I've got a question for Jesse. It's very inspiring. It's visually very interesting. The marching cubes. Would you mind just explaining what exactly are marching cubes? Why are they called marching cubes? What's the driving force behind creating them?
Sure, and I apologize. My video is a bit opaque on the technical details. It's in the associated paper. The marching cubes are named after the algorithm from which they are derived. So the title itself is just, that's what William Lawrenson and Bill Klein called their algorithm, which was developed to take MRI scans. When MRI scans first emerged as a technology, there wasn't an appropriate visualization mechanism for them. They, an MRI scan makes a point cloud and at various densities, and somebody needed to write the software to put this on the screen so that doctors could make use of it in real time, or at least relatively quickly. And that became an early way to take a data and turn it into a surface and then visualize that graphically. What made that interesting to me as an architect and my collaborator Luke, nearly 30 years later, was it's simple enough to be turned into something physical. I mean, a lot of you could interpret any algorithm to make a sculpture, but in this case, it's quite a literal translation of the procedure. The lookup table associated with the algorithm has between 15 and 21 elements, depending on how you make certain decisions. And those elements have been translated into these cubes that are handheld and can be manipulated. And after that point, we experimented with a few different materials over the years, but this 3D printed plastic version of it has kind of transcended the algorithm, at least as an experience. It's now just really fun and intuitive, and people build whatever they want. There's a set of instructions provided, but what I'm actually quite interested in now is just letting people work with the units and see how they interpret the procedure based on the visual cues that are embedded in the unit. So they don't actually have to learn anything algorithmic or understand computer science to make use of these tools. And that's sort of the state of the project's in now.
Oh, well, while we're at it, there's a follow-up question in the chat from Xiong Yu. In the beginning of the video presentation, there's a mention of General Electric and the Pixel. Can you tell us more about that and how that relates to your work?
Well, so Lawrenson and Klein were researchers at General Electric, and so the associated intellectual property is attached to General Electric. It's not patented exactly as computer algorithms are not so much patentable, but that's where they worked. So the General Electric Association is just that's who paid for the research and development. Okay,
I see. I've got a question for Paul. I find the approach really interesting to take social media, which is a 21st century invention, and combining it with a 19th century invention. So the question I have is, Marshall McLuhan, in his tetrad of media effects, asked, when a medium is replaced by another one, what does the medium retrieve that has been obsolesced earlier? What does the medium recover which was previously lost? So my question is, what does the telegraph key reveal that was previously concealed?
I think from the readings that I did as background for this paper and for other work I've been doing, is there's this general perception that a new technology comes out and everything about it is new, and it doesn't necessarily acknowledge what came before. And certainly as we get further and further away from some of these older technologies, as social media or the telegraph and other communication systems that preceded that, they tend to get lost or buried under this idea that progress is very linear. But everything I'm finding is that progress is quite cyclic, and there's little traces of past media that keep reappearing in the development of new media through history. So that's really what tweaked my interest about looking at connections between social media and what is the social in media. And I really just went back as far as the telegraph as a bit of a starting point at the age where more the globalization of communication took a large step forward and connected that to how the internet and social media has done that on a larger scale.
So that's interesting. Actually, I have a question for all of you. When we're talking about visualization or materialization of abstract concepts and algorithms, or just data in general, there's always the question between data accuracy versus aesthetics. So where do you draw the line between something being faithful to the original data and something being aesthetically engaging?
I've never considered my work a scientific tool, so I don't hold too closely to the science. I start as a foundation, so it's the original language that I work with. But once I'm doing the visualizations, I kind of go wherever I want. It's more about being evocative and sort of reaching a larger public, perhaps, particularly with the issues that I'm dealing with, which is aerial congestion. So I don't need to make sure that everyone knows exactly how many planes. I can sort of show them as an abstraction, and by doing that, still reveal a great deal of information, but not specific to, I don't know, the empirical studies that science might do. So I'm pretty loose about it, honestly.
Okay, so it's a question of getting people engaged in what the message you're trying to convey. That's interesting. I've got a question for Jesse. In the age of AI and its closed algorithms, is there a value in making algorithms obvious, so making them apparent to people?
I wanted to answer the last question. It was a lot easier.
No, well, you can go ahead. You can build up on the.
No, I was just going to say I was going to say that most of what I do is exactly as Scott describes. I have a series of more photography-based work that is, evocative and all about subjective choice. This particular project is probably my only project where I'm somewhat trapped by it doesn't work if it doesn't follow the algorithm procedure. So it's not so much an aesthetic choice; it's just the project would not function if it wasn't true to the process. But to answer your other question, I have had, I've recently been writing about the value of my Marching Cubes project as a pedagogical tool and kind of exploring with some educators, is this a good way? It clearly, when I watch people work with the tool, let's call it, they learn something and it demonstrates something very quickly. There's intuitive access to how a computer would think, in a sense. And so I've been exploring with people, well, how could we use this as a teaching tool? Clearly, it could be used in computer science to teach this specific procedure, but that's a pretty narrow use case, not so interesting. More generally, it forces humans into operating like computers. I mean, they follow in order to build the thing, like with Lego or anything else, they follow the procedure. But unlike with Lego, there's not a lot of flexibility at the end. When you're building something, it kind of has to be as drawn, and there's a set of drawings come with it. But I guess I don't know enough about AI personally to connect it to this more contemporary algorithmic space. I think there's tremendous value in helping people understand in some ways just how simple computational procedures are. There's certainly in the general public a sense that this is a really mystifying thing. And of course, those of us that work with computers recognize that it's, they're relatively simple procedures. It's just when you stack them on top of each other, they can achieve enormously complex results. And so in that sense, I think it's a valuable tool.
Oh, interesting. So do you feel that there's some sort of poetry to materialization or visualization? There's an aesthetic language associated to that.
Certainly, I've been saying so in writing, and I've been trying to convince people that there's make a case for that there's a visual language associated with a procedure. I think we can only stretch the metaphor between computational procedures and language so far. I mean, one is very rigid. Language itself, human language or animal language, has a nuance. Perhaps some forms of AI start to reach, but Again, I don't consider myself expert in that. But I do think there's quite a distinct visual language associated with all computational procedures, and it is a question of teasing it out. I think a lot of work that we're all doing is, in a sense, teasing an aesthetic out of something that is, a system that, could be described entirely numerically, and we're just doing a different form of description.
Okay, so I find it interesting because what you all do is take something that might be considered generally dry and transform it in a way to make people think about it in a different way. I've got a question for Paul. You mentioned that you have a media archaeological approach. For people who are not familiar with media archaeology, what's the specifics of that particular approach?
There are a number of approaches. There's been a lot of attempts to define media archaeology as one thing, but everybody views parts of it differently. So the approach I've taken in a broader sense is more of a material approach rather than a narrative or discourse-based approach. So actively working with an object, looking at how it works, looking at the materiality, the history behind it, and trying to place it into newer contexts or unfamiliar contexts that it normally wouldn't be considered part of. So, I mean, media archaeology, its original appeal to me was that it was the lack of definition, and in some ways it felt like a bit of a rebellious child that was pushing against the general accepted narratives of history, linear progress, etc., etc. So I looked at how, I guess, in a way that rebelliousness could be applied in a creative sense to put these objects into different contexts, unfamiliar contexts, reimagine them or represent them in a creative sense. That probably doesn't answer what media archaeology is.
Well, media archaeology is somewhat of a fluid concept in my understanding.
Yeah. Yep.
But yes, I think that maybe the key aspect is to reinterpret obsolete media, which your work seems to be doing very eloquently.
Mm. Yeah, there was some early writing by Theodore Adorno, who basically was looking at Walter Benjamin, and it wasn't media archaeological in a sense, but he was basically saying it's time that we looked at progress or history from the perspective of the vanquished rather than the victor. And I guess in a sense, that's what media archaeology is looking at times, although, since its early days, it's advanced and almost became this rhizome that's touching on so many different aspects of media and culture and technology today. That there is no one area that it sits comfortably in. It's spread across a number of disciplines and areas.
Yeah. So yeah, it does try to cover blind spots from media theory.
That's
interesting. So I've got a question. Well, in general, so how does the visualization or the reification or materialization of abstract concept have the potential to change the public's perception of these phenomena?
I think for me, because I'm working with a visibly present object, it almost gives a tangible connection between that object, or whether it's an obsolete piece of media, etc., and the general concept behind the work itself. So in this case, Twitter. And I have had a few conversations with people that have seen the work, and they've been interested in that connection, that social media connection, or the social in media connections that they didn't really understand existed as well. So I guess it's just putting a little seed into people's minds that says, well, maybe there's a wider history behind these technologies that we could look at. And doing that through foregrounding these pieces of obsolete media is just one way I can do that.
Okay.
I feel like your question, I mean, that's the promise of media art in general, is that, you know, we complicate people's relationships with, I'm sorry, and that's not to criticize the question, that is the question, is how can we are all complicating people's relationships with technology of some kind, and the question is, how are we doing it? Is it effective? And in some cases, is that even our intent? I mean, are we setting out to have public impact, or is there some more conceptual exploration and everybody's, but yeah, I mean, to answer it more briefly, yes. I mean, that's the hope, I think, in work of visualization of any kind, is that you alter a kind of mechanistic and relationship with technology, and the assumption that all is good and everything is progress and so on. I mean, we do. That's the dark thing embedded in everybody's work, is to ask hard questions that aren't being asked by anybody else, or very few other people, and doing it in a way that isn't this sort of outside of academia. Ideally, reaches an audience that doesn't already know that these things are troublesome.
That is actually quite interesting, because being artists allow us to express things that would not reach an audience if we were to write a more traditional paper that were an academic paper. So we are sort of blessed that way to have an alternative audience. I've got a question for Scott. Well, actually, and many of you can pick up on this, but were there any unexpected discoveries, results, or reactions to visualizations? And did it expose any underlying patterns or biases that you were not expecting when you actually took the data and made it into a visually engaging artwork?
It was a struggle from the beginning to get the data. Originally, there was a lot of resistance because people considered it secretive. And especially in 2004, right after 9/11, to try to get airplane data was highly problematic. Nobody would give it to us. I was working at UCLA at the time, and I ended up studying football schedules and learning about football at UCLA, because one of the guys at the Federal Aviation Administration was a big Bruins fan. And it took me almost a year of getting his trust before he gave me the aerial traffic data that Aaron eventually visualized. So there was kind of a transition between data being private and data becoming public that occurred over the last, 15 years. Now all this data appears online mostly, and I mean, Elon Musk puts all of his data on the internet, whereas initially it was considered very, very private and very dangerous to play with it. So there was that element of it. I particularly liked what Jesse said too, the idea that we're teasing an aesthetic out of a system. Each one of us is sort of working with ghosts, in a sense, of things that are invisible to be seen to the public, and trying to find ways that the public can just see them in a way that they can understand. It gives us a lot of freedom, because, again, we're working with things that are completely non-visual and trying to find our own way of presenting them. And if you hit the right nail on the head, suddenly you can reach a lot of people. The stuff that I've been doing, I've had to show it to the Navy as well as to secondary schools. So it's got to be something that can sort of cross bridges outside of the particular skill sets of the people that work in those fields, but then also sort of help those people understand what they're doing larger. In the PowerPoint slideshow, I showed the example of Powers of 10, which was actually made originally at IBM as a way to understand large numbers. So all of what we're doing is, again, what Jesse said too, is it's all media art trying to reach a broader public. But the tools and the ways that we do it, that's where all the freedom and the play comes in.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, like as Scott mentioned, I mean, we've all now, I'm so pleased to learn the origin of this visualization of flight that is now, as you pointed out, commonplace and almost ubiquitous. Like, if you think of, I would not have known how to imagine flight visualized as a system until Scott started this suite of work that you now see in commercials and in music videos and so on. So that's that. I mean, Scott, was that an unanticipated level of impact? I would guess that this would become almost a visual language that's commonly understood.
Yeah, I talk about that in the paper, actually. The idea that, everybody was showing the individual objects in the sky, and it was Aaron and I that started to show them as trajectory. And then that became kind of the way information arts went for a while there. And I think it's still the same way. So it was not intentional. Honestly, I just loved planetariums when I was a kid. And when we started visualizing all this stuff, it just made the most sense. So we started doing the drawings, and then we did the processing code, and then doing it in the Maya software at the time, which was 2004. So yeah, it took on a style of its own. Particularly Aaron's section of it became such a meme at the time that it really did have an impact on a lot of the ways that people now visualize trajectory in almost every field.
Wow, so that's quite a feat. There's a question in the chat right now. So as much as the source information is abstract, what were the inspiration for the particular aesthetics of your respective projects? Interesting question.
I was going to ask that of Jesse, actually. There's color built into your work. How did you choose the colors?
Oh, well, that's a great story. I needed 5 colors. It has a dumb technical answer, which is I needed 5 colors. There was a fateful decision to 3D print the pieces, which, in my paper, I talk about how that might have been a mistake, although very interesting, because it was at a scale that 3D printing doesn't really lend itself to. And at the particular juncture when I purchased the materials needed to be inexpensive and span a range, and literally that was, I sat with my students and we looked at every option, and that was the only kind of aesthetically, I happened to have a penchant for magenta, and that kind of created I'm very, very tired of that color scheme at this point, I should add, and I now make them in a different color scheme altogether, but it was contingent on what filament for 3D printers was purchasable in large quantities in the year 2016. As a kind of a sad reason. Now I've found sources for whatever color I want, which makes me happy, but I wish I had had that option when I first started the large fabrication process.
Well, sometimes limitation can, enhance our creativity because we have to work around these constraints. Maybe I'll ask the question again. In this case, for Paul, so where does the aesthetics of your project come from?
So one of the things that I do with my work is I try and foreground the sound producing object. So sitting the telegraph key on a plinth with all the other componentry hidden away inside was a way of doing that. The telegraph keys are basically black or a very dark grey. So to again highlight that, I thought a white plinth, which looked quite minimal in terms of an aesthetic, was an approach I took as well. So that was really what it was. The keys were black, the plinth was white. Minimalist approach, foregrounding those keys and trying to maintain the focus on those objects themselves.
Okay. And does your work, does it constitute some sort of critique on Twitter or social media in general? Do you find that it does hold a message about the way we use social media?
I think it holds a bit of a message about how we write or how we communicate now. And as I said in the video, and it's in the paper, this dumbing down of language that some people saw as an issue with Telegraph and Twitter, when it's almost like a natural evolution of language itself and how that's been developed. I guess the other reason for putting the objects on on top of the plinth in quite a minimal way is that by taking the Twitter messages, stripping out all the richer content, which obviously a Telegraph could never transmit videos and images, etc., etc., just as another way of, I guess, showing that language or that message has been minimized in a sense as well. So it's down to its core base elements of text characters converted to dots and dashes.
Okay. And the sound aspect is important also.
Yeah, the sound, the two sounds there. You know, we have the clicking of the keys.
Yeah, I think you use an interesting expression. You talk about the materiality of sound. Do you want to elaborate on that? I think it's very evocative.
Yeah, so I guess the thing is, you look at those keys and they all look the same. They all are manufactured through the same process, but during time, their mechanisms have been eroded in different ways. So there are just slight sonic nuances that come out of each key, whether it's caused by the tension of the springs, the way the contacts have been eroded, and they have slight sonic differences. So you can actually hear those when you get up closer to the works and identify those across the different keys. And then I added another form of material sound with the sine tone, just as a connection to the Telegraph as well. But in this case, when the Telegraph key connects, which is considered an on, the sine tone is actually disrupted, which was a connection to the way they used to test the resilience of the Telegraph lines by having a continual signal being transmitted through them and only broken by that Telegraph key. So for me, that's almost a slight disruption, because you're expecting a sound to be on when the contact hits, but in fact you're hearing an absence of sound from that perspective as well.
Okay. So maybe another question for Scott. Does your work have a goal to try to educate people about Kessler syndrome, which is the issue of having too much space debris and having these satellites that crash into one another until space is no longer usable? So is there an environmental underlying environmental cause to your visualizations?
Absolutely, yes. I think it's the biggest issue coming up. It is amazing to me that Elon Musk was approved to put up 43,000 satellites, and no one questioned that. It was someone with a lot of money, and there's no particular laws up there yet. And I think that level of debris, or that debris, just that level of machines up there, even though everybody treats the real estate as if it's so large, it's kind of like the Wild West, you know? Even when we were interviewing launch companies way back in 2004, they admitted up front that when they launch, they're not sure they're not going to hit anything. There's absolutely no control over it at all. So the idea that we are creating a situation where it will end our ability to possibly go to other planets, it will end our ability to look out into the sky, that is all coming very rapidly. And it seems like it is a conversation very few people are talking about because, well, we have a news cycle that's so busy with everything else right now. So in one sense, yeah, it is definitely very much about the environmental issue. The aesthetics, obviously, as well. I like how machines create their own form of poetry, but underneath it all is the concern that we are creating a situation that we can't come back from.
So I assume that's also the case with the airlines, the air travel. That is, it's known to be unsustainable, but you know it's still increasing year on year.
Well, I don't know about this year in particular.
Yeah, probably not. But 2020 is somewhat of an outlier in many respects.
I'm more interested in the fact that the different layers are becoming polluted. In other words, it used to be everyone stayed within their own lane of traffic, and they divided it by altitude. Whereas now there's complete disregard for that. People are just flying their drones wherever they want. California is having tremendous problems with drones right now. They cannot put out the forest fires because the helicopters can't get in because of all the personal drones. So the airline level is pretty well regulated because it's such a long established industry. But these new industries that are coming up have no regulation and are starting to affect the other industries that are above them, so ahead of them. So yeah, I do think each industry is going to start having problems. Like I said, President Trump's Air Force One was nearly hit by a drone just 3 weeks ago, and it probably would not have caused tremendous damage, but if it hit the right part of Air Force One, it could have taken that plane down.
I think it's interesting the way, and Scott, you brought this up in your paper, that we lack the ability to imagine this three-dimensional situation, and maybe that may be our brain's limitation, or it's because we just haven't had enough experience with it. But the notion that these places are busy, and then the disconnect when someone like Musk shoots a car into space and nobody's screaming about litter. I mean, that because it's sort of disconnected from people's. If you threw a car into the river and just smashed it there, that would be a travesty. But you throw it into space and oh, that's cool, and it'll burn up. Maybe. But so there's like the way that you're starting to touch on the disconnect that we have with these less known kind of ephemeral spaces, and the work begins to bring people closer to that. I would hope that we start to develop a connection with, oh right, that zone in the sky above us is full of stuff, and that stuff is in conflict. As we kind of we're now starting to understand the ocean, I think, a lot more clearly, at least, than we did in my childhood. You thought of the ocean as just an empty expanse, and now we understand it to be full of garbage. So just translating that knowledge to space and to everywhere, and just we are polluters par excellence. This is our main contribution to the world.
I do think governments also want us to think of these things abstractly. I mean, and large corporations. I mean, it's not a cloud. It's a bank of massive computer warehouses all over the world. So they keep sort of treating these spaces as if they are completely ephemeral and no danger to being used and filled, when in reality it is these hulking technologies that we're putting into these spaces that will eventually conflict with each other.
Okay. I've got a general question. I'm very interested in what we call in Quebec research creation, but sometimes it's referred to arts-based research, and I find that all of you have a practice that's based on arts-based research in some way. And one of the goals of arts-based research is to examine the practices of artists. So do you have any specific insights on how you work and how serendipity is involved in the process of creation, how you can benefit from happy accidents or failures in your own work?
It's interesting that we each exist in a unique educational context. I mean, so we're speaking in Montreal, a world hub of research creation, and of media art, and then Scott kind of I gather runs a program of various types in Hong Kong, and then we have a student, and so each of us, I guess I'm kind of answering the question obliquely to say that I'm very affected by the specific context in which I'm making my work, which is I I teach in an art program that isn't media art specific, and I don't really have a kind of research lab in the way that I think a lot of research creation actors in Quebec do, or other places, and so I'm not sure. I wish I was taking better advantage of serendipity and a kind of collaboration with others, but in a way I'm a bit kind of single-minded on the one project I have on the go right now, and it's not as multifaceted as I would like. I'm inspired to hear these other stories of the way, the way that my colleagues here are working, and that there's sort of like a context of many projects feeding into many ideas, and that is exciting. And it's also why, of course, we come to conferences like this, is to remember that there's a world of people working in similar ways that we can talk to sometimes when we're not, even if we can't travel.
So anybody want to add to that? The idea of serendipity or failure, or just the general way you work tends to affect the final output of your artworks.
A lot of what I do is team-based. The larger sculptures usually have a team of 20 to 30. This project had, the original version at UCLA had almost 20 different animators working on it. So working with a large team, you always have serendipity. Things come out of it that you didn't expect, and the personalities of the individual come into it. I really like the Canadian version of research creation, the idea that artistic research is integral and just as valid as the scientific model. And, a scientist sort of works to separate themselves from an experiment, but an artist deliberately puts himself into it, and his experience in dealing with the data is part of the final artwork. So I think it's very valuable that we have the mistakes, and we have the collisions, and we have the sometimes confusion of the languages in each of these fields, but collectively we all work together, and the final projects kind of show that amalgamation of different perspectives.
Okay. And Paul, in your own experience, so if I understand correctly, Scott works collaboratively with a team. In your work, you work alone, if I understand correctly. And so,
Yes.
what's this peculiarities of your own work, the way you work on your artworks?
Yeah, I think just conceptually, there is an element of serendipity to everything I've done, because I'm not saying, hey, here's an interesting object, now what can I do to create something with it? It's more through something I've read or just experience that I think, hey, there's some interest here that could be applied in a creative way. So all my research is being done by myself, but I'm lucky to be working in a lab with similarly minded people doing their own work, and it's a good way to talk about what we're doing, if we've got problems, how we can overcome them, just sharing resources, etc., etc. Learning from mistakes in one project that can be applied in another project, things that can be done better in that way. For me, I didn't come into this as a trained software developer. I didn't come in here as an engineer. I didn't come in here as a designer, but these are all skills that I've had to learn as part of this. So I'm actually, the thing for me is being a multidisciplinary piece of research is probably allowed me to be more creative than I would have been if I'd been working within one single discipline. Yep.
Oh, okay, we have a question. It's actually a more technical question on the chat, and I think it's probably for Scott. How could we take away some of those clustering satellites, pushing them into the graveyard orbits?
Well, now you're talking about a lot of money. More of it's coming out through surveillance. A lot of people are looking at ways to shoot down satellites, and at least to break them up when they come into low Earth orbit and then start to burn up in the atmosphere. So there's nothing we can really do to fight companies that are making a lot of money, except to write to your government and say, please control the real estate up there. But the Chinese are already doing mining on the moon, and there's already weapon systems that are being developed by different countries around the world in space around us. Technically, the United States is a little bit behind everyone else right now, even though we are launching the most satellites, with China, Japan, and India coming in second. So it's going to still take public action to raise awareness and then to sort of promote a way to reduce the number. But Elon Musk is moving forward. His 43,000 satellites will be up there within 3 years, and that's all been approved that it's going to happen. So I don't know how to stop it. Honestly, I wish I had a better answer for that one.
So do you think it's going to have the same impacts as colonization had in the past century? Are we colonizing space and the area above us in a way that's detrimental in the long term?
Colonization is a difficult word just because it implies people. If you think about it, we already have a planet in our solar system that is completely populated by robots. I mean, Mars only has technologies living on it right now. So it is a technological colonization, which I'm not sure that's the right word. So it is going to get worse and worse, and particularly if we find rare minerals on the moon, China will be very aggressive about controlling that particular space and making sure that they're the first and the only ones out there. So it's going to become more competitive. It's going to become more angry. I think there's going to be battles and fights. And as soon as systems start crashing into each other and people start losing money, then it's going to start to get really ugly. Sorry, but it's hard to be hearing.
That's tough to hear, but I figure it's 2020, so things are not always looking very rosy. Yes, go ahead.
Scott, I'm just curious. Have you ever looked into launching a satellite in any of these works? I mean, these micro satellites that get a bundle. I mean, my students and I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole of because you can bundle them up. Like I assume Elon Musk satellites go in bundles of 1,000 or something. They're not
tiny. No, I've never tried it myself. I worked with the International Space Station a couple of years ago, and we were going to send up a studio to the space station, like an artist studio. Instead of a small studio to do a scientific experiment, we were going to actually design an art studio that could be on the space station where we could actually make art. The problem was the schedule didn't quite line up with Hong Kong, and now the friction between the United States and China has gotten so bad that I don't think I'll be working with NASA again very soon, as long as I'm living here, which is too bad. But yeah, I'd love to play around with it more. When I was a kid, I did model rocketry, but that's as far close as I ever got.
Okay. So maybe in a more general sense, do you think your practice is about expanding the limits of the human imagination, going beyond what we can fathom in our minds and trying to represent it in another way? So are we trying to actually improve the human ability beyond the limits of our imagination? Is that a correct way to put it?
I think across all three of us today, we're all doing that in different ways. Obviously, Scott has added this huge dimension by looking at space and what's happening up there, which it's almost an out of sight, out of mind field. So he's bringing that back into the human consciousness. Jesse, I think, with the cubes, it's a very tactile method of exploration, which, it's like building blocks that you may have played with as a child, but now adults can work in that medium as well. And you can build anything you like by putting in your own object, which I think is cool. And for me, I think it's just defamiliarizing certain media, just to ask that question or plant a seed that the things may not be as you perceive. There are other questions you could ask, and find a different narrative through these works as well.
I like that defamiliarizing. It's interesting. So trying to make the familiar seem uncanny so that we can question it. I think it's a very has a lot of potential. Since we've got just a few minutes left, I've got a very classic question, but I always find it very interesting. What are your future endeavors? What do you like? What are your you plan on making, or just ideally, what would you like to work on in the following months and years?
Can I register a disagreement with the last question?
Sure.
Just because we got to have a little controversy or some kind.
Of course.
Because I like the question. Like, I'd like to think that we're expanding the human imagination. That seems like a really lovely thing to achieve. But there's a part of me that there's maybe a techno-positivism to that. That we're really. I think the human imagination is pretty darned impressive, and I would hesitate to ascribe any artist expanding the limits of the imagination so much as maybe exploring corners of it that this might just be a semantic thing, but maybe stretching to corners of it that aren't as often explored. And that good art is doing that. But I mean, you think of the power of the imagination and all the things it's brought to the world in the absence of any technology at all, and the predictive power of fiction, the 200 years in advance, and these sorts of things. Like I really don't think I'm achieving that kind of impact with the work itself.
That's quite interesting.
Yeah, I think I second that emotion. Also, I think in each of our cases, we sort of pull back a curtain as far as, Jesse, I knew nothing about marching cubes, and to now see it visualized, I understand a technology that I didn't understand before. And the same with Paul's work, in the sense that, to me, because of the political system in the US, Twitter is a very evil thing. And to see it kind of reduced to these sort of playful machines in a really primitive media archaeological technology kind of reminds me that it is not this big, powerful political force. It really is just a technology. So I think for the question you asked earlier, for me, a lot of this isn't about expanding the imagination. It's almost about materializing something that people have become to imagine almost too much. We're sort of dialing it back, saying, wait a minute, these are just technologies.
Well, it's interesting to think that somebody imagined each of these technologies before we got to play with it. I mean, it is wild to imagine the telegraph for the first time in the 19th century. Like that's just like, oh, we'll just connect a bunch of places with wires and tap on those wires, and boom, we're going to communicate. I mean, that is such a remarkable stretch of a leap of faith, and So it's not to diminish the work that we do at all. But like Scott said, we're almost bringing people back to its original imaginative state. It's like, imagine it as something different than it is. Imagine Twitter as something different than it has become, and bring it back to its sort of state of wonder. Where what an interesting kind of way of transmitting information quickly and reaching lots of people really. And then Trump gets on it, and then it's become something else. And so, I mean, maybe that's another way to twist the question: is that the function of our artwork is to permit people to go to bring these technologies back to their beginning, and put them on a different trajectory that wasn't taken.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I think the telegraphy is a good example, because it's paradoxically a very basic technology. But at the same time, it's very complicated. If you wanted to get into telegraphy today, it would involve a lot of mental gymnastics just trying to get around the concept. So it's quite interesting. So we've got a few minutes left, 4 minutes remaining. So I was just wondering if there's any closing statements, or if you want to talk about, like I said earlier, your future endeavors, or maybe I could add something. We were talking about the failure of imagination, And I think maybe that's one of the problems we have today, is that, for example, global warming, people fail to imagine that in this huge, they look at the sky, they look at the planet, it's so huge. How could we ever be able to have an influence on it? But yet it is happening, although, it boggles the mind. So maybe that's one of the points of visualization, trying to get things that are so unfathomably important into something that is easy to apprehend. I don't know if you agree with that statement.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess we're running out of time. I've got 3 minutes left. Okay, and maybe one last question. Have you? How does the public react to your artworks? Do you have any? For example, with the marching cubes, how do people do as instructed, or they try to essentially make stuff on their own?
I talk about that a little bit in my paper. One of the qualities of marching cubes that stretches me as an artist is that it's pretty easy to take it outside of an art context and it becomes something completely different. And that observation has precipitated all sorts of new questions. Like when I install it in a gallery, even if there's a performance and I invite people to perform with me, there's the social code of the art gallery that governs what people will do, and I have to work really hard to get people to touch something that, in an environment where touching is not permitted. But when I bring it to a school, I of course it's a completely different story. I mean, just immediately they don't listen to me and just do whatever they want, and that's so that's been really rewarding, actually, to be able to observe all of the different ways in which different audiences can engage with what is it's always the same thing, but is received so differently, and a good reminder of the importance of who your audience is and how you're addressing that. And just while I'm here, I'd like to thank Montreal for having us and for also supporting media art so significantly in the world. I mean, you are literally the world center of this kind of work. So I wish I could be there in person.
Me too.
Well, thanks for being here. It was great. And actually, I'd like to point out a comment from Nicolas Lachance, who says, "Thank you for all this wonderfully complex and interesting conversation. Your projects are all extremely original and insightful, and I cannot agree more. So thank you all, and it was great. So I hope I will bump into you again during this virtual symposium. Thanks again."
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.